March 7th, 1945, west of the Rhine. The thaw has begun, but winter has not yet released its grip. The roads are a black paste of mud and oil. Ruined farm walls stand in the mist like broken teeth. Somewhere beyond the low hills, American artillery keeps its slow and methodical pulse, each distant concussion arriving through the fog a second after the flash, as if the sky itself is breathing in iron. In a roadside orchard outside a shelled village, a cluster of German officers moves past an abandoned American truck and a torn ration point, expecting the usual trophies of war: fuel cans, ammunition boxes, canned meat, cigarettes, perhaps coffee. Instead, among the wreckage, there are insulated containers, paper cartons, and the impossible softness of something beginning to melt in the cold: ice cream. In a Europe that has spent years tightening its belt with holes it did not know existed, the sight is not merely strange, it is disorienting. It does not belong to the grammar of collapse. It belongs to another world. That is why the moment matters. Not because ice cream changed the course of the war by itself, and not because one dessert could explain the fall of the Third Reich. It matters because war is rarely decided by the thing that looks most dramatic on a map. It is decided by the hidden architecture beneath the map: rails, fuel, refrigeration, labor, sugar, spare rubber, replacement tires, dairy contracts, cold storage, truck routes, harbor cranes, and the confidence of a state so materially secure that it can carry luxury to a battlefield and still not call it luxury. By 1945, the German army was fighting inside a shrinking geography of promises. The American army was fighting inside an expanding geography of supply. That difference could be heard in the sky, seen in the depots, measured in tonnage, and on mornings like this one, tasted in a spoonful of half-frozen cream. For years, many German officers had been taught to imagine the United States as a civilization of comfort without hardness, of machines without soul, of abundance without discipline. Nazi ideology needed that illusion. It needed to believe that mass consumption produced softness, that free citizens were weaker than subjects drilled by obedience, that a nation of shop counters and factory clocks would recoil from attrition. American life looked vulgar from afar. Too many automobiles, too many advertisements, too much sugar, too much noise, too much private desire. In that worldview, ice cream was not just food. It was proof of decadence, something for children, for peacetime, for societies that had forgotten history. German officers expected to meet exactly that sort of enemy: rich, overfed, impatient, and spiritually unserious. What they encountered instead was an army that had converted abundance into method. American comfort had not vanished under pressure. It had been militarized. The same industrial culture that once flooded towns with refrigerators and soda fountains now flooded continents with trucks, bridging equipment, aviation fuel, frozen stores, bakery output, field kitchens, and replacement parts. The sweetness remained, but it moved inside a system of astonishing hardness. Ice cream was no longer a symbol of softness, and it became evidence of a civilization whose productive depth was so immense that even morale could be industrially scaled. Long before American troops crossed into Germany, the United States had built a logistical universe large enough to make perishables a military category of war. On March 19, 1941, the Army's Quartermaster Market Center system formalized a separate structure for procuring and distributing fresh foods. It expanded rapidly beyond fruits and vegetables to include milk, butter, cheese, ice cream, poultry, eggs, meat, fish, and frozen produce. Seasonal storage programs placed huge quantities of perishables into cold storage for later use, and by war's end, that system had procured more than $3.5 billion in perishable subsistence, nearly 11 million tons. This was not improvisation. It was state-scale nourishment engineered with the same seriousness other powers reserved only for shells and rifles. That hidden machinery helps explain the shock of the orchard. The officers standing over those insulated containers were not really looking at dessert. They were looking at surplus power. Ice cream required milk, sugar, stabilized transport, cooling equipment, time, packaging, and protected routes. It required the confidence that these things could be spared. Germany, by 1945, could not guarantee enough fuel for movement, enough rail integrity for continuity, enough air cover for daylight transit, enough calories for civilians without looting the future. America, by contrast, had built systems so deep that it could keep sending non-essential essentials. That is what unnerved the observer, the realization that the enemy's margin was not merely military. It was civilizational. American commanders understood morale as a practical form of combat power, and the bureaucracy around them learned to quantify that instinct. During the war, roughly 80 million gallons of ice cream were manufactured annually for the U.S. Armed Forces alone. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal considered it an important morale factor, and in 1945, a decommissioned concrete barge was converted into a refrigeration vessel capable of storing nearly 2,000 gallons while moving through the Pacific to serve Navy and Marine personnel. Another account describes the Navy's BRL refrigerated barges as able to make 500 gallons and store 1,500 more, while the Army produced 135 million pounds of dehydrated ice cream mix by 1943 and supplied machines and ingredients to create tens of millions of gallons more. By February 1945, according to the historical account cited by military.com, the Army was building ice cream factories intended to bring half-pint cartons right into the foxholes. To a German officer trained in the grammar of scarcity, this bordered on madness. But it was a very specific kind of madness, the madness of a democracy with continental resources, industrial redundancy, oceanic insulation, and a political culture that believed ordinary men in uniform should be fed as citizens, not merely consumed as material. That belief was imperfect, inconsistent, and often riddled with contradiction. America was still segregated. It still asked black soldiers to sustain a freedom at home that did not fully include them. Yet that contradiction itself became part of the strange shape of American power. The trucks kept moving because democracy, even unfinished democracy, could mobilize energy in ways closed systems often mistook for weakness until the steel arrived. And the steel did arrive. After the breakout from Normandy, Allied armies moved so quickly that logistics nearly failed to keep pace with victory. The answer was not rhetorical bravery, it was the Red Ball Express. From August 25th to November 16th, 1944, more than 6,000 trucks and trailers hauled 412,193 tons of supplies, gasoline, ammunition, oil, food, and everything required to keep the advance alive. On August 29th alone, 132 truck companies operating 5,958 vehicles carried 12,342 tons forward, and the system ran on a one-way route under strict speed limits and spacing rules, day and night, with an average of 899 trucks dispatched forward each day. About 73% of the motor transport service personnel in the European theater were African American, and black truck companies formed the living muscle of this logistical river. So when American supplies seemed to appear everywhere, in hedgerow clearings, beside shattered crossroads, behind advancing columns, in depots hacked out of French fields, they were not appearing by miracle. They were appearing because thousands of men had driven through exhaustion, rain, blackout conditions, mechanical failure, and enemy attack to make presence look effortless. German officers saw the result, but often not the human chain beneath it. They saw stacks of crates, lines of fuel cans, hot coffee, fresh bread, cigarettes, chewing gum, and sometimes a sweet so absurd in war that it felt almost insulting. But the insult lay in the mathematics. Every carton of ice cream suggested 10 other things that had already been solved: milk collection, sugar allocation, refrigeration, transport security, timing, fuel, spare parts, maintenance, and road control. Somewhere in Normandy, a captured German soldier marched past one of the great Allied roadside supply dumps, is recorded as having said, "I know how you defeated us. You piled up the supplies and then let them fall on us." It is one of the most revealing battlefield observations of the war. Not a complaint about cowardice, not a lament about enemy trickery, a logistical verdict. Defeat in that sentence was not described as a matter of spirit alone. It was described as the experience of being buried under an avalanche that had been assembled crate by crate. That is the deeper meaning of the ice cream in the orchard. It was not a curiosity found at random. It was the edible edge of a mountain. The German officers lifting those cartons, turning them in gloved hands, perhaps brushing off dirt and frost, were touching the outermost layer of a system so enormous it had room for tenderness. In the Wehrmacht's final campaigns, tenderness had become suspect. Sugar was rationed, fat was rationed, time was rationed, fuel was rationed, hope was rationed most of all. A military culture raised on hardness had begun to treat deprivation as proof of moral seriousness. By that logic, the ability to provide pleasure looked unserious, yet the battlefield was delivering a different lesson, where hardness without replenishment decays into hunger. Sacrifice without abundance eventually sacrifices itself. The officers would have known, even if they did not say it aloud, what their own men had been eating in those last months of the war. Emergency substitutions, thin soups, bread stretched by fillers, meat more rumor than ration, horses slaughtered when fuel vanished and transport failed. In static sectors, regulations still promised respectable caloric totals on paper, but by late war, paper and plate had drifted into separate realities. In the East, units disintegrated under conditions far worse. In the West, even formations still capable of fighting did so under the shadow of dwindling reserves and collapsing mobility. The German state had become a machine that could still command death, but could no longer consistently command nourishment. American forces, by contrast, could still distinguish between calories and morale. That distinction mattered. Armies do not live on fuel and ammunition alone. They live on the maintenance of personhood. Coffee at dawn, hot food after rain, tobacco in a lull, mail in the evening, a shave when possible, a dry pair of socks, a spoonful of something cold and sweet after weeks of mud. These things tell a soldier that he has not vanished inside the war. Ice cream, ridiculous as it may seem in artillery country, performed exactly that function. It reminded the man eating it that home had not disappeared. The Republic had extended one of its ordinary comforts across an ocean and through battle. And by doing so, it quietly said, "You are still a citizen, not just a body." That message had ideological force. Totalitarian regimes are always tempted to glorify deprivation because deprivation is a language they can control. They turn scarcity into virtue and call luxury corruption. Democracies, when functioning well, do something stranger. They try to distribute dignity through everyday life. Not perfectly, not equally, and not without hypocrisy, but they do attempt it. A half-pint carton of vanilla at the front was not merely sugar and cream. It was a little republic of assumptions that comfort mattered, that morale mattered, that ordinary people deserved more than survival, and that industrial society should serve the many before it celebrated the few. It is easy to romanticize that idea now, and history does not permit innocence. But American abundance during the war existed alongside rationing at home, labor conflict, racism, censorship, profiteering, and the brutal arithmetic of strategic bombing. Yet even with those truths intact, the scale of what the United States achieved in supply remains staggering. Engineers built cold storage facilities and ice plants in theater. Quartermaster systems separated perishable from non-perishable food logistics with unprecedented sophistication. Field, BC, hospital, convalescent, and travel rations were categorized, rotated, and adapted to combat conditions. Even when full A rations could not reach units in fast-moving operations, the intention remained visible. The best possible food the situation allowed, then better food as soon as the road opened. The recurring object in this story, then, is not simply ice cream as a sweet. It is ice cream as cold. Cold is the miracle. Cold means electricity, insulation, compressors, maintenance crews, spare seals, disciplined loading, punctual movement, enough fuel to waste none, and enough capacity to waste some. Cold means you have defeated rot. And rot in war is always waiting. Flesh rots, food rots, institutions rot, ideologies rot from the inside when they can command obedience but cannot preserve life. The little untouched chill inside an American carton represented not just dairy science but political confidence. It said the system carrying it was intact all the way back to the farm. For the German officers in that orchard, the realization would not have been theatrical. Real historical disillusionment rarely is. It comes quietly, through accumulation. A ruined bridge here, a strafed convoy there, a village already full of enemy fuel drums, fresh cigarettes on dead Americans, hot chow and prisoners' recollections. tank columns that somehow return with parts, artillery that never seems short, air cover that arrives like weather. Then one morning in a war-torn field in Western Germany, a paper cup sweating in the cold. The mind does not surrender at once. It hesitates. It searches for explanation. Perhaps this was a lucky shipment. Perhaps propaganda had exaggerated. Perhaps Americans were wasteful, not strong. Yet beneath every rationalization, a harder thought pressed in. No army at the edge of its capacity sends desert to the front. And the front noticed. American soldiers noticed too, even if they did not always articulate the political meaning. They noticed the taste, the relief, the ridiculous joy of it. A spoon against paper. A white curl softening at the rim. A sweetness that did not belong to shellfire and therefore mattered all the more because of it. In war memory, food often survives where strategy blurs. Men forget the names of crossroads and remember a peach, a loaf, a can of coffee, a piece of chocolate, a scoop in unbearable heat. Ice cream entered that memory not as luxury alone, but as evidence that the vast machine behind them had not forgotten the individual appetite. There was another reason the image stayed powerful after the war. German prisoners carried it into reinterpretation. The title speaks of officers in the field, but the wider transformation did not stop at the battlefield. It continued in camps and labor detachments and canteens, in the ordinary, humiliating miracle of being fed by the country one had been taught to despise. National Archives records show that the number of POWs held in the United States peaked at 425,871 in May 1945, of whom 371,683 were German. In U.S. camps, regulations required pay of no less than 80 cents a day for labor and set limits on work hours, while camp administration monitored sanitation, recreation, and conditions with bureaucratic regularity. The effect of that encounter with American plenty could be intimate and devastating to old certainties. In a U.S. Army article, former German POW Günter Gravy recalled standing in a camp shop in 1944, deciding whether to buy ice cream or Coca-Cola first. He wrote that the last ice cream he had been able to buy in Germany had been years earlier, and Coca-Cola had been unavailable to him entirely. He chose both. In that moment, he said, he suddenly realized how lucky he had been to be captured by the American army rather than the Soviet one. Elsewhere in the same article, he reduced prison life to a brutally simple truth. All we cared about was the food. It is difficult to read that without understanding how ideology withers when set against sustained material contrast. That transformation was not universal. Some prisoners remained committed Nazis. Some hardened their beliefs inside captivity. Some learned nothing. But many encountered a troubling fact the Reich had concealed from them. The enemy was not collapsing under democracy, comfort, and pluralism. The enemy was thriving because of them, or at least because of the productive society they helped sustain. The American camp meal, the camp library, the wages, the chance to buy ice cream, the sheer scale of available food, all worked slowly against the myth that authoritarian discipline possessed a unique claim on seriousness. If a free, argumentative, commercially loud, socially imperfect republic could feed its enemies better than the Reich could feed many of its own, then the moral geometry of the war no longer looked simple. Even in the camps, food had strategic meaning. A National Park Service account of Papago Park quoted the camp command philosophy in terms of discipline, respect for enemy rights, diversions for the mind, and good meals, adding that there was a method to this madness. Humane treatment was not only law, it was message. It aimed outward, toward German treatment of Allied prisoners, and inward toward the ideological contest beneath the shooting. So when we return to the officers in the orchard, we should resist the temptation to make them symbols too quickly. They were still part of a murderous war machine. They still served a regime that had built extermination into policy and fantasy into command. Yet history becomes legible precisely when such men are forced to confront things their world cannot explain. A pistol can be explained, a tank can be explained, even overwhelming artillery can be fitted into old military logic. But ice cream at the front, in the last winter of a total war, requires a more painful admission. It requires acknowledging that the enemy is ship. It cannot survive being permanently out-organized by a civilization that has industrialized both necessity and comfort. Perhaps that is why the image endures more vividly than a spreadsheet ever could. The human mind understands history through texture, through the scrape of a spoon, through the sting of thawing air, through the sight of officers in field gray staring down at an object too soft for the world they had built. Ice cream became, in that instant, not childish at all. It became historical. It carried the full insult of abundance into the camp of scarcity. It said the Republic had enough steel for guns and enough milk for sweetness. It said the war would be won not only by killing better, but by sustaining better. It said free societies, for all their vanity and noise, may possess a hidden ferocity whenever they learn to organize ordinary life at extraordinary scale. And in the long shadow after 1945, that lesson did not disappear with the snowmelt. Europe would rebuild not on speeches alone, but on shipments, credits, calories, machinery, fertilizers, rails, and power grids. The same civilizational argument embedded in that paper carton would reappear in ports, warehouses, and relief packages. Freedom would have to prove itself in bread, coal, medicine, and work before it could persuade the exhausted. Ideology had marched Europe into ruins. Logistics would help lead it back out. So the image remains: a ruined orchard, a broken truck, a white sweetness in a paper cup. Not a grand monument, not a medal, something colder, quieter, and in its own way more final. Because tyrannies often understand how to command hunger, but free nations, when they are strong enough, generous enough, and organized enough, can do something more difficult. They can send cold into chaos. They can send comfort into mud. They can remind a frightened conscript, and even a captured enemy, that civilization is measured not only by how fiercely it fights, but by how much life it can still afford to preserve. Richer, not only in resources, but in social organization, in labor coordination, in transport, in refrigeration, in civilian industry, in trust, in the expectation of ordinary pleasure, and perhaps in faith that the individual soldier remains worth the trouble. That trouble mattered. Somewhere behind every frozen carton stood farmers milking cows under wartime schedules, factory workers sealing packages, railway crews unloading perishables, mechanics servicing compressors, clerks allocating tonnage, engineers raising ice plants, and drivers navigating roads slick with traffic and fear. The final spoonful at the front contained all of them. That is why ice cream could symbolize democracy more honestly than a speech. Speeches promise, systems deliver. Freedom, if it means anything in a modern war, must eventually become logistics. And here, the emotional contrast becomes almost unbearable. The German officer had expected to find proof of weakness and found proof of depth. And he had expected an enemy spoiled by comfort and found an enemy strengthened by its ability to reproduce comfort under pressure. He had expected democracy to mean disorder and discovered that democracy, at least in American form, could also mean scale. Scale in procurement, scale in movement, scale in calories, scale in morale. The symbol did not roar. It melted. That was the humiliation. Not a heroic banner, not a dramatic last stand, but a sweet thing softening in the March cold while the Reich ran out of everything except commands. In the final weeks of the war, Germany would still kill. It would still resist, still execute, still burn, still force children and old men into absurd lines of defense. But beneath the orders, a material truth had already become irreversible. The gap was absolute. Absolute not because Americans had more of everything at every moment, but because their system could recover, replenish, replace, and indulge at scales Germany could no longer imagine. An army can survive hard. In that sense, the ice cream was never trivial. It was the war in miniature. Milk and sugar protected by steel. Pleasure carried on discipline. Softness made possible by strength. A democracy imperfect enough to wound, yet powerful enough to nourish. And for those German officers who found it there in the wreckage of their collapsing world, the revelation was not that Americans had dessert. It was that Americans had enough country left over, even in war, to keep dessert cold.